Hello, wasa tuiti, or good morning. How are you doing today? Gleit ka klenach Meda DeWitt yuchat duasak linget klenach zetzinak yuchat duasak nanyaina chatsati kachari yeti chachti shtakin kwan ayachet. My English name is Meda DeWitt. My Tlingit names are Zetzinak and Klat. My adopted Inupiaq name is Tigiguluk, and my adopted Cree name is Boss Eagle Spirit Woman. And I am on Dena'ina Eshlana, the traditional territories of the Dena'ina people in Anchorage, Alaska. And I was blessed to be part of this training team and to help to deliver this part of the presentation that has to do with our traditional ecological knowledge and incorporation into our adaptation planning. So part of our traditional culture is our stories of where we came from, how we got here, and how did we become a peoples. And we have to look back to our ancestors to help anchor us as we move forward. You know, we say community resilience through tradition. And there's a bit of a translation issue because tradition in the Western context is something that was past tense and it's very rigid, where for our tradition, adaptation and resilience is part of who we are. So tradition actually helps us to evolve and to move, and it's supposed to teach us so that way we can be successful in a continually changing world and environment. And we've done this before, right? So there's two parts of this. One is we have our traditional ecological knowledge and our stories and traditions of who we are. And then two is the action over anxiety. Some research was done in Northern Canada, and the researchers found out that action is better than anxiety, right? It feels better to go do something and instead of just watching it happen. There is a little bit of a challenge there for those of you who've been in climate work or adaptation work or advocacy work. You know that it does feel good to do something, be active, proactive. But there's also the capacity for burnout when you're just in that activist or advocacy state all the time. And so we have to kind of transition that and say, okay, what is our traditional stories of where we came from? So the research into climate grief and solastalgia are we can look at those through a lens of psychological trauma, right? The changing seasons and landscapes. There's also the actual loss due to erosion or flooding or fires. And then there's loss of habitat, loss of our fish some years in our streams, and loss of that stability, because we've been in a very stable climate for millennia, right? So part of this framework is there is the physiological response that we experience, but overarching this transition that's happening, we'll have to view it through a psychological response. So trauma occurs when you're unable to mitigate or cope with a stressor, right? And healing requires the reconstruction of systems based on empowerment and restoration of relationships. So our traditional people used to have winter villages and summer villages, not all of them, but the majority of them. The only people that usually were stable to one spot year round were our whalers, and they had the deep cellars, and they were usually up from the coast a bit with those deep cellars. So that way they could weather out the winter storms. But traditionally, we had winter villages and summer villages, and they had different climates. They had different access to foods and terrain and different stability. But with the Western system, when it moved in, it wanted, it built around our summer villages for the use of the waterways for trade systems. And then from there was the building of infrastructure. So schools and post offices predominantly in our rural communities. And there's, that stress where we came in from a very adaptive, cyclic system where we moved with the seasons. And then when we transition into the Western system, it's very stagnant and it doesn't evolve to change very well. And in psychology, that's a failure to transition is kind of the term that's used because people can't cope with the idea of moving or transitioning. And so if we look at through that lens and we say, what are our traditional migration stories? Because we know that this system being a stagnant system is going to have to adapt. It's going to have to change. It's going to be forced to change. And so people who stay within that system, it's going to be very difficult if they can't shift their thinking. And our elders told us that we'd have to go back to the old ways. And some of that was very literal, like using our medicines and traditional foods, but some of that was also in context, right? The way that we think and the way that we have internal and external culture is going to have to go back to the old ways. So connectivity to Mother Earth and to Creator, and going back to that community-based thinking and structures. And our traditional migration stories recount difficult situations. For instance, in Southeast, we have the coming under the glaciers story, where pre-contact, thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, we had two groups. One group was inland, and it was Athabascan or Dene, and they had a crash of the climate, right? It was climate change at that time. And Alaska Native people have lived through many different sessions of climate change. The difference with this one is the immensity of it and how fast it is happening. So the last major climate shift with the melting of the glaciers and the large glacial plates was that adaptation from the inland to the coast. And the food systems were crashing, the game animals, the fish, the plants, everything. So people were experiencing starvation. They were also experiencing death and more accidents because people going out farther and having less nutrients, more emotional and mental health stress. And they came to the point where they knew that if they stayed in that one spot, that they would perish. And the only hope that they had was by taking that leap of faith and then migrating to a new place that would have, hopefully a better system. And of course, the medicine people and the elders, they went into vision and they deep dialogue to make this decision. It wasn't just a happenstance. There's a lot of intention that went to it and in the process too. So that's where we get the coming under the glacier story, where the two old women went under the glacier to make sure it was safe for the community to travel. And then two young men went over the glacier to see if they made it. And in that story, fortunately, they did make it. But part of that process was letting go, right? So they had to let go of that space where they were in, that land area, and they had to let go of the women going under the glacier. And so we have two canoe songs, Canoe Song 1 and Canoe Song 2. And Canoe Song 1 is a cry song, and that's that letting go of people, that intentional release. There's a coyote in my front yard. I'm in Anchorage. I've never seen that before. That's pretty wild. Sorry, but that just caught me by surprise. But Canoe Song 1, that grieving song, when they're letting go, I'm not going to sing the whole song, but the vocals are way, way, he, ya, hey, 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 he, ya, hey. And it goes on. And they let go, and they let go with all of their prayers, all their hope, all their intentions, with their best made plans, and they surrendered. And the old ladies went under the glacier, and the two men went over the glacier, and they saw that they made it and that it was safe for the community to travel. So the community got in their canoes and they went under the glacier and out to the coast. And indeed, there was a set environment on the coast that was accessible for food and fishing and game. And there was already people on the coast. And that's part of our oldest law, is the reciprocity and relationship between the Raven people and the Eagle people. So the people on the coast were considered the Raven people, and the people who came from inland were the Eagle people. Used to be Wolf, but now people refer to them, the Moides, as Raven and Eagle. And so in that transition, coming into a new place, the people who received them, they accepted them into that space, and they fed them and they clothed them. And of course, there was still a lot of grief, right? That grief of letting go of that, their home, all the people that they lost, into a new way of being. And that song, Canoe Song 2 of the coming out, it's the lifting of grief, right? And it's Hinisa, yeah. But the older version is Elisa. That's the Dene language base. Elisa, Elisa, yeah. And so that's the song of lifting up, come out and play, come out and be alive, come out and hunt, come out and fish, lift your spirit and be alive again. And that's that repairing song. So we have to look at this transformation of going through climate change, because there's nowhere else to go, right? Like, we can move our communities to a safer spot, but we can't just leave Alaska or leave the world. And even if they did colonize Mars, they'd take like at most a few thousand people, and that's it. The rest of us would be here. So the transformation that we're going through is mental, emotional, spiritual transformation, where we have to go back to our old ways of being in balance and reciprocity with nature, to being good human beings again, versus stewarding the land and taking care of each other in our old traditional ways and sense. But we can use Western technology and adapt, right? Our elders tell us that we're supposed to use the best of everything that's given to us. We're, best approaches, the best technology, the best way of doing things, and in our traditional sense of what a measure of best is, right? With the highest ethics and regard, with the highest outcomes, and with the consideration of the community benefit, not individual benefit. And the story teaches us that, the process of letting go and grieving and cleaning up our space and transformation. And the reason why this isn't a historical trauma story, the reason why it's a story of strength, is because of the sovereignty, the ability to identify the problem, work together as a group to create a solution, and then enact the solution. And in that process, when them coming to the coast, those two groups coming together, they created the Tlingit Nation. That's the birth of the Tlingit Nation, is through that story. And so we can look back to all of our communities, all of our cultural groups, indigenous groups. We've been here, some of us 10,000, 12,000, 14,000, 24,000 years, and even longer, according to some of the traditional stories I've heard. Interior, I've heard traditional stories about saber-toothed tigers. Up in the north, I've heard George Edwardson talking about the migration between Umiak and Utqiagvik. Every time the sea level rises, they go to Umiak. Every time it comes down, they go to Utqiagvik. And Umiak is the place where it's called that because there was whale hunters that had a really big whale and it overturned the Umiak. And so that's how high sea level was at the time. And he says that they've been through 7 transitions migrating up and down. So we need to impart that information into our Western adaptation planning, because until we connect our traditional knowledge and ways of being, that adaptation planning will never be sufficient to carry us through the changing times, because everything that has been considered stable is going to change. And we need to work in the mindset of community wellness, and not only community as just humans, but community as all of our relatives, right? Our fish, our plants, our animals as well, and extend our worldview back into the holistic sense. So connection to community through caring for each other and stewardship of the land. With all of my work with medicine people and elders, with prophecies and traditional knowledge, that's the 2 main points that's going to get us through this: connection to community through caring for each other and stewardship of the land. So Ganesh Chish, Ganesh Chish, Ganesh Chish, Hasha Kakao.